Welcome once again to the Anita Dialogues. This is the November edition that we are conducting this year. As you know, in the run-up to the celebration of Netaji's 125th birth anniversary next year, we have started this earlier in February 2021. And this episode also happens to be a milestone episode in that direction, because today we are conducting the 10th episode of the Anita Dialogue series. I'm very privileged that over this period of the last 10 months, I've been relentlessly supported by the honorable guests who have joined us. And last but not the least, to mention the continuous patronage of Dr. Anita Pfaff, in whose name this event is being held. And she is with me here today as well. So I wish to welcome you, Dr. Pfaff, and thank you for being with us through these 10 episodes. Any opening comments from your side?
Welcome to all of you. Jai Hind. I'm very happy that today we sort of can provide a link between the main station of this organization on the one hand and the history of the Indian independence struggle in Germany and with Indians across the globe. I guess I don't know from where all you'll be watching, and I hope you will have an interesting time with our two main speakers, Professor Pelinka and Mr. Mukherji.
Yes, thank you. Last month, actually, we were in Asia with this episode, Singapore to be precise. We were discussing the establishment of the provisional government of Free India that happened, because we are following history here and we are not following geography. So history is taking us back here in Germany this month, and it is here that we wish to discuss the milestones in Netaji's life in the month of November. And as Dr. Pfaff said, we have two very distinguished gentlemen with us, and Dr. Pelinka and Dr. Mukherji, to take us through today's episode. I wish to welcome you, Dr. Pelinka, first. Dr. Pelinka is with us as a political scientist, but if I were to do justice to his introduction, then if I have to read his CV, which runs into multiple pages, I would perhaps need one complete episode to talk about his accomplishments. But in brief, Dr. Pelinka was born in 1941 in Vienna, Austria. He studied law in the University of Vienna and then political science. And through his innumerable years of studying and academics, he has been the professor of political science in the University of Innsbruck in Austria between 1975 and 2006. And he has also been the professor of nationalism studies and political science in the Central European University in Budapest. He has since retired from his professional life, but not to mention that an academic never retires. So that's how he is continuing to pursue his passion in studies. And in connection to today's topic, he has in fact done a significant amount of work on Netaji as well, which manifests itself through a book which was originally written in German, but later translated as well. And the name of the book is Democracy, Indian Style, Subhash Chandra Bose and the Creation of India's Political Culture. Dr. Pelinka, very privileged to have you in our show. Welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I feel honored and privileged to be able to participate in this discourse about a very important figure of the history of the 20th century and Subhash Chandra Bose's impact on India, on modern India, on contemporary India. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I think we will continue from there because Mr. Kiran Mukherji, who is joining us as well as the second privileged panelist, I wish to hold back his introduction for a later part of the event. But before we go to that part, Dr. Pelinka, since you are already there, I wish to perhaps set the context with you first about today's event, because we have covered portion of Netaji's activities in Europe and Germany in one of the earlier episodes, but we thought that this episode in November is quite important from the perspective that it was in this month that he established the Free India Center in Tiergarten in Berlin, which essentially was the epicenter of his activities with the then government in Germany, and how he wanted to mobilize the support of the Axis powers in the struggle towards India's independence. So for the benefit of the viewers who might or might not have the broad understanding of that period, since he left Calcutta in January 1941 and then landed in Berlin on 2nd of April, could you perhaps help us paint that part of the history in order to set the context of today's discussion, Dr. Pelinka?
Well, first, of course, the basic strategy of Subhash Chandra Bose was to try to build alliances with any power which was fighting the British Empire. This was the main reason. This was a strategic thinking of him when I came to Berlin. He was not a friend of Nazi philosophy. He was not a friend of Nazi racism, but he thought Nazi Germany could be helpful to free India from British rule. And this was the basic strategy. And then the strategy started soon after he came to Berlin, because about 6 weeks after he came to Berlin, Germany started to invade the Soviet Union. And this, the result was that what Subhash Chandra Bose had in mind, to build a kind of grand alliance against Britain, became now a grand alliance against Nazi Germany. Especially when in December 1941, Germany declared war on the United States of America. So his understanding was to come to Berlin to build an alliance, but due to a certain development he could not influence. We know he was critical of Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union, but this in a certain way resulted in a complete isolation. He was isolated in Germany. He had some friends in the German Foreign Office, but Hitler completely ignored him. The official German government ignored him more or less. Germany was never willing to sign any declaration in favor of Indian independence. Germany had no interest in an independent India. Just some weeks before Bose came to Germany, when Molotov visited Berlin, Germany offered India to the Soviet Union. You should take care of India. So he just was isolated. He was in a certain way a little bit misunderstanding Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was no fighting, and we never have fought for Indian independence. Nazi Germany was unable to understand the will of Indians, the will of the Indian National Congress, the will of Subhas Chandra Bose to gain Indian independence. This was in a certain way different when it came to Italy, but Italy was already a much weaker part of the alliance, and of course Japan. And this was the reason why Bose left after less than 2 years Berlin, because he realistically understood that when he was fighting Britain with an ally, Japan would be the only realistic partner, but it was too late. But this, I think, misunderstanding started when he came to Berlin, and whatever he did in Berlin, of course, radio broadcasts were very significant to raise Indian public opinion, and volunteers were building a certain kind of Indian national army, which came into existence later on in Southeast Asia. But Nazi Germany was unwilling, uninterested, and completely misunderstanding the idea of Indian independence. And this was a tragedy, the tragedy of Subhas Chandra Bose. He came to the wrong country at the wrong time, looking for the wrong ally.
While that is correct, because there has been references of Hitler's belief against India in his book as well, but help us understand if this was the situation, then it needed a lot of courage for a lone man to fight it out diplomatically and politically in that atmosphere, war atmosphere in Berlin, and at the same time secure sponsorship in support of a diplomatic status, for example, and all the benefits. Because I don't think that they rejected the concept altogether. What they were doing perhaps is they were continuously postponing the declaration of India's independence or the government in exile multiple times, which was actually frustrating Netaji. And he has expressed this a number of times, both to his counterpart, Rohrman, as well as to Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, for that matter. So Germany was also trying to capitalize the ex-president of the Indian National Congress to play it out in the politics of World War II, isn't it?
Well, of course, Ribbentrop shook hands with Subhas Chandra Bose, and later on, after waiting for a long time, even Hitler had time for a brief meeting with Subhas Chandra Bose. This we know. But concerning German strategy, Germany never had any plan to give India independence. Germany was the most colonialist power. Germany was more British than Britain when it came to the rule of white people over non-white people. So this is the background why Hitler offered Molotov in November 1940, we will fight Britain, and you should fight Britain by invading India. Not by freeing India, but by invading India. India should become a dependent territory for the Soviet Union. Molotov did not agree, we know this. But this was a way of thinking in Nazi Germany. White people should rule over non-white people. This is a racist concept of Nazism, and this is why Subhas Chandra Bose was unable to succeed in Berlin. It would have been maybe different. I don't think significantly different, but maybe to a certain extent when Germany would not have invaded the Soviet Union, when Germany would have concentrated on the war against Britain. And this would have been a different scenario. But when Germany invaded in June 1941 the Soviet Union, the basic concept of both building a global alliance against Britain was over. And this is the reason why, despite some heroic efforts by some Indians, especially Indians who became prisoners of war of Germany, especially North Africa, it was not a success. We have to accept that both came to Germany at the wrong time, to the wrong place, looking for the wrong ally.
So, Dr. Pfaff, any thoughts on that from your side?
We have to try to put ourselves into the frame of thinking of those days. Of course, we are looking back on knowing later developments which had not come about at the time or were not known that much. When Netaji left India to escape from the British, essentially, his original idea was to get support from the Soviet Union. And of course, at least I do not know whether the Soviet Union at that time already contemplated that the alliance with Germany was rather tenuous and would be over soon. In any case, they were not particularly interested in supporting Netaji's struggle against the British, and the only thing which they agreed to was to allow him to pass through the Soviet Union to get to Germany as another possible ally. Professor Pelinka pointed out that Germany was the wrong ally. Maybe Germany would always have been the wrong ally, even if it had thought this alliance in the 30s already, before the Second World War started. Even if it had, because there was always, at least on Hitler's part, I think we are talking about the German government in general, and evidently not everybody had the same position, but in any case, Hitler was always hoping to strike an alliance with Britain rather than with anyone else in the long run. So he certainly was not a convinced supporter of Indian independence vis-a-vis Britain, and that became quite clear, but there was a certain interest for some time, as long as it was clear that Germany did fight Britain, to sort of half-heartedly support anything that might weaken Britain. But certainly Germany was, even though not a major colonial power at the time, one probably can say, it wasn't because they would not have liked to be a colonial power, but they, in a way, they were the Johnny-come-latelys in the 19th century, and then, of course, whatever power they had and control they lost at the end of the First World War. It is quite clear that Japan's position vis-a-vis India was a more positive and friendly one, even though Japan certainly was a fascist and a fascist power trying to gain control over other countries in the region around them. But in a way, possibly India would have been too far away for them to control in any way. But I think Germany was certainly a second choice for Netaji in this effort.
Just one remark. I fully agree. I was speaking of Nazi Germany, not of Germany.
Yeah.
A democratic Germany, being a great power like the Germany before 1914, which was half democratic, but it was a great power. This would have been an interesting ally. Nazi Germany, from the very beginning, was unwilling, unable to understand what Indian independence implied. So Nazi Germany was a particularly completely wrong ally. That Nazi Germany was fighting Britain was not a sound basis for a strategic alliance between the Indian independence movement and Nazi Germany. But I agree, it's not Germany. It has been the Germany between 1933 and the Germany which started World War II in 1939. This was the impossible and wrong ally.
Yeah, there are multiple archives in Germany, Italy, and Great Britain, and several books are in the market, which is a result of researching those archives that is available. While the macro perspective is correct, but am I wrong in believing that the Free India Center and the Sonderreferat Indian, which was created in the German Foreign Office, was a result of these persistent efforts and the pressure that Netaji put after he arrived in these are realities, right? Why would Nazi Germany, I can understand they are sponsoring a movement as a apparent support, but why would they set up a bureau like a Sonderreferat Indian within their foreign office if they believed that they would not have anything to do with Indian independence? I believe it has to do with a lot of the courage that Netaji showed in his negotiations.
I think, yes, there have been Germans, especially diplomats in the Foreign Office, which had a deep understanding what Netaji was all about, and also thought it would be a great strategic idea, by the way, which also Mussolini had, to form an alliance with an Indian independence movement. But first, those diplomats in the German Foreign Office were of secondary importance. And secondly, all were anti-Nazis. Some of them were murdered after July 20th, 1944. So it was the anti-Hitler opposition, which partly understood what Netaji wanted to do and sympathized with Netaji. But Germany in 1941, when Netaji came to Germany, was a one-party totalitarian dictatorship. So whatever other Germans were thinking about did not really matter in politics in Germany.
Okay, so whatever we are discussing right now is an analysis of the situation that Netaji faced in his first few months when he arrived in Germany. But irrespective of whatever happened and whatever stonewalling, I should say, regarding his major objective that Germany supports the declaration of India, which Hitler continued. Hitler and his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, continuously pushed back, frustrating his effort. Nevertheless, it all culminated in one achievement, which is what we were trying to say is a milestone in the month of November, is the creation of the Free India Center in Berlin. Irrespective of what it wanted to achieve and what it achieved or could not achieve, this was an activity which had a significant impact in the Eastern theater of the war as well, because many of the things that was done or attempted to be done here was carried forward by Netaji from the west to the east. So, Dr. Pelinka, if I may request you to give us some color into the Free India Center in Berlin.
Well, yes, the Free India Center could have become the core of something which happened in Singapore in 1943, a kind of government in exile, based on a clear declaration of the German government to be in favor of an independent India, like the Japanese leadership did in 1941 and especially in 1943 when Netaji came to Singapore. So it was a possibility, but it was at the end a kind of propaganda center, not being able, not allowed to influence German politics. Not allowed because Germany did not want to become, to allow the Free India Center become for any realistic political factor. Maybe as far as I know, the literature, the only significant impact was Subhas Chandra Bose's participation in Radio Free India, radio broadcasting, which reached to India. Some people, a lot of people, a significant number of Indians followed the broadcasting program under the tutelage of Subhas Chandra Bose. This had a certain impact. And we know that Britain was afraid of this. And George Orwell, for instance, working for BBC at that time, was a counterpart of Subhas Chandra Bose. He criticized Subhas Chandra Bose to be a tool of Nazi Germany, to have become a tool of Nazi Germany. So this was some realistic impact, radio programming, because this was to some degree an efficient propaganda tool for Indian independence. But as Germany did nothing to follow this by, for instance, agreeing to a declaration like Mussolini wanted to do, for instance, like Japan wanted to do, to declare one of the main goals of the Axis powers is to create a free India. This was impossible to reach because of the German leadership. Mussolini would have done it. Japan did it, but not Germany. This is the reason why I thought it was the wrong place at the wrong time. Berlin was the wrong place at the wrong time.
Correct. And I think many of these activities of the Zentrale Freies Indien that all of us see on the screen were actually accomplished in the Eastern theater of the war, something that we discussed in last month's episode when we talked about the establishment of the provisional government of Free India. And honestly, it was in Berlin that Netaji tested a lot of these concepts, like setting up of the departments of propaganda, publishing, intelligence, broadcasting, handling of the POWs, the unique identity of his government, significant amongst which being the usage of the Congress flag, but replacing the Gandhi wheel with the springing tiger, emblem that later historians like Hugh Toy has a kind of used to describe Subhash Chandra Bose himself. And last but not the least, very importantly, the seeds of the national anthem and the national language all were actually sown in this Zentrale Freies Indien. And it is at this point in time, I think we will take our discussion a bit more deeper because we have someone as a panelist amongst us, and I would like to formally welcome here Mr. Kiran Mukherji, who has been patiently listening to our conversation. Indranil, if you can please put Mr. Mukherji into the spotlight. And I would like to bring Mr. Mukherji into the discussion because before discussing the depth of the activities of Netaji and the Free India Center in Berlin, and what they did and how they struggled in this effort for independence, I would like to take you back or take you forward from this period, 1941, some 17 years ahead, where if there is someone from Times of India who is watching this, and if he searches the archives of the Times of India in 1957, there was an article which was written by Mr. Sundar Rao, Mr. Sundar Rao, talking about 100 years of India's independence struggle, because 1857, we all know, it was the first war of independence in the Indian freedom struggle. And there was an article in the Times of India celebrating that, to which there was an anonymous person who replied with a letter to the editor. This is the one that you see on the screen. It was featured under the Reader's View, and it was featured on 29th of August 1957, and it was signed by a senior officer and a founder member of the German INA back in 1957. Now, Times of India still doesn't perhaps know who was that anonymous person, and it is my distinct privilege that I have the permission of Mr. Kiran Mukherji to disclose the name of that anonymous writer of the letter. He is Mr. Brojulal Mukherji, Mr. Kiran Mukherji's father, who was in Bombay at that point in time. And if you go through this letter, you will understand a lot about the struggle and the efforts that this first army of Subhash Chandra Bose, if I may put it that way, did in Germany, and how they kept up the war of independence despite the challenges and the neglect they faced in Nazi Germany, some of which has been mentioned by Dr. Pelinka already. So, Mr. Mukherji, I wish to formally welcome you to this discussion with a brief introduction about you for the audience. Mr. Mukherji was born in, I will keep that date of his birth a bit of a suspense, but he was born in, actually he was born in Dhanbad in Bihar, while his sister Gita was born in Breslau in Germany. His parents, Brojulal Mukherji and Eva Marie Mukherji, were married in Germany in 1943. There is a big history behind that, which I'm sure he will talk about. And they arrived in Bombay after the war in January 1947. Eva Marie Mukherji and Mr. Brojulal Mukherji settled in Bombay, while Mr. Kiran Mukherji visited the Cathedral and John Connon School in Bombay between 1955 and 1965. Now, here is a trivia. It is the same school that is featured in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children. Salman Rushdie happens to be 2 months older than him and 1 class senior to him. But the interesting part is Mr. Mukherji says that he is still in contact with the 2 of the schoolmates who are mentioned in the book. So fiction is not always fiction. Books are not always fiction. This is a lot of reality as well, which still continues, as Mr. Mukherji says. In 1966, he came to Germany to study architecture at the TU Munich, where he graduated in 1972, and then he pursued his career in architecture. Professionally, he is specialized in building in tropical areas, and he has executed a number of projects in India as well. 2 in Gujarat and 1 in West Bengal. And Mr. Mukherjee was born exactly 3 days before 15th August 1947. So I'm not very sure, Mr. Mukherjee, whether I should call you the Midnight's Children. Welcome.
Yes, namaskar, first of all, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, you've already introduced me, so there's not so much to say about myself. Perhaps I can give a brief summary of my father's earlier history. He was born in 1912, and he grew up in Bhagatpur in Bihar, and later in the late 20s, the family moved to Calcutta, and that was the ancestral home of my father's mother. And her brother was, he studied with Netaji at Presidency College. So they were good friends. And Netaji came to that house on a few occasions. I don't know whether my father had met him, but I mean, there was a connection from the family side. So my father was studying in Calcutta in the 1930s. He was in St. Xavier's College, studied textile chemistry. And then in 1937, he came for further studies to Germany, and he worked in Chemnitz in Saxony, in Germany. And when he was more or less finished with his studies and his practical training, the war broke out. So his plans to go back to India, well, he couldn't realize those. And he had to look for some means of subsistence. And he found a job in Berlin as chief printing manager of the German Fashion Institute in Berlin. And my mother was the assistant to the director of this institute. So that's how they came to know each other. And my father, in those days, I think it was very, very difficult for people because food was rationed and he didn't have a place to stay, and he must have been looking very sick and weak. And my mother, well, took him in and kept him up and gave him food and accommodation and everything. And so that's how they got to know each other. Now, this happened not only to my father, but also to many other Indians who were in Berlin. And the interesting thing is that in those days, there was this famous screen writer, Thea von Harbu. She was married to the famous director, Fritz Lang. And she was also later on married to an Indian, a Maharashtrian, Mr. Ai Tendulkar. And this Ai Tendulkar, he moved back to India because he had some plans to work over there. But he had asked Thea von Harbu to take care of the Indians who were in Berlin and who were suffering because they had very little to eat and lots of problems. And she was quite rich. So she did all she could to help these people. And she organized a weekly dinner for these Indians. It must have been about 20 or 30 people. And she paid for everything. And it was a wonderful time for those Indians. At least they could survive that way. So, but this was before Netaji reached Germany. But when he reached Germany in April 1941, these Indians, they were very excited and they joined Netaji. Not all perhaps, but quite a few. And my father was also one of them. And I think the contact for my father to Netaji was easier because of his connection through his uncle. And so they were together in the Free India Center. And I don't know exactly what the role was of my father, but I think he was quite intensively involved in all the discussions over there, because in this picture you can see this was taken when the INA was actually, the Indian Legion was actually started. And my father was one of those 5 students and 3 prisoners of war who came, who were sent off by train. There's Netaji over there, and Thea von Habu also came to see them off. So that was the starting point of the Germany, INA as they call it. Yeah, so that was one of the activities of my father. Afterwards, of course, the Indian National Army or the Indian Legion grew to be about, I don't know, 3,000 strong. But that was the starting point. And what did I want to say? Sorry.
Regarding that letter, Mr. Mukherjee, regarding that letter to Times of India.
Yeah, no, that came much later. No, what I wanted to say is that in this team at the Indian Free India Center, he was one of the speakers of Azad India radio. He spoke in Bengali. And the interesting thing is, in those days, he couldn't be in touch with his family, but they were listening to the radio, to the news from Germany, and they recognized his voice, or maybe he also mentioned his name, but they were very, very happy because they knew he was alive. And I mean, they were hearing terrible stories about the war in Germany, but knew that he was alive and he was with Subhash Chandra Bose. So that was a nice episode for him. Yes, about that letter, I think there's a lot of things that he has written in that letter. He was part of the group that discussed the name Netaji. I mean, I don't think it came from him, but I mean, there were many people who were thinking about a nice name for Subhash Chandra Bose. I think he was not very keen on that, but later on it became the name he was always called by. But also later on in 1942, on September 11th, there was the inauguration of the German Indian Center in Hamburg. And there the Indian national anthem, Jana Gana Mana, was officially presented for the first time. And nobody was willing to sing it. So Netaji asked my father, and my father liked singing, so he agreed. And so he sang it at this occasion. So that was the first time it was officially presented. Yes, wow. I don't. Yeah, this is a picture which shows. I don't know what the occasion was, but it seems that some people were being decorated. Some new recruits for the Indian National Army were being inaugurated over there, and so yeah, that's just a photograph that I found, which shows him together with Netaji. Yes, the other thing was that my mother and father were at the Free India Center for quite some time, I mean, quite regularly. And they got very friendly, became good friends of Netaji and Emilia Schenker. And my parents wanted to marry. They had been together for about 3 years. And since they knew that Netaji was married to Emilia Schenker, we thought, why shouldn't they do that? And my mother went to get permission. In those days, you couldn't just go and marry. You had to get permission from the Nazi authorities. And the officer over there was very, very rude. And I don't know what the wording, but he must have said something to the effect that valuable German blood should not be mixed with the inferior blood of some foreigner. And my mother was devastated. She didn't know what to do. And so she went to Emilia Schenker. They were good friends at that time. And she knew that they were married, Netaji and her. And somehow Netaji got permission for them to marry. That was in February 43, just before he had left himself. But it's probably the last thing that he undertook for his friends. And I'm a bit surprised about this permission because his marriage to Emilia Schenker was actually secret. It wasn't public, I think. And yet he got this permission. And I read only recently in a book by M.R. Vyas that Netaji had good connection to some senior Nazi officials. And we were wondering who this could be, or he was wondering who this could be. And it was found out that Heinrich Himmler, he was one of the worst brutal Nazis of those days. He was a good friend of Netaji because he had read a lot about Indian mythology, and he was a fan of India. And so they met quite often, and I suspect, or people suspect, that he was the man behind many, many things that happened over there, because Hitler was actually against the INA. He also ridiculed those Indian soldiers. He said they wouldn't even be able to kill a fly. I mean, he was very, very negative about the Indian League. But I would suspect that the person who gave us this permission, gave my parents the permission to marry, could have been Heinrich Himmler, which is not very nice to know. But if it was not for this situation, I would not be in existence. So a little bit I do owe to Netaji, definitely, and Mimi Schenker, but also perhaps to some Nazi. Yeah, that was, and the reason, when my mother married, she lost her German citizenship and was given an alien's passport, which you can see on the right, Fremdenpass. So she was without a country. She had no passport, but then later on, because of a marriage with an Indian, she got an Indian passport. Yes, now, after the war, actually my father was in the war. He worked in Holland, in Netherlands, and later on in Bordeaux in France. And he was telling us a few stories about that. But unfortunately, my knowledge of all this is full of gaps. I can't remember everything, but he had met his colleagues or his comrades from the Indian League. Later on, they visited us in Bombay. And that's where I get a little bit of the information, which I know now. But the interesting thing is that many of these people, they're named in many of the books of on Netaji, but one can't really, one doesn't have a face, one doesn't know what they look like. And so it was interesting for us because we met them. They came to see us in Bombay. And there was people like Ali. Yes, sorry, this is a stage before that. After the war, my father was imprisoned. It was in a place near Paderborn, and that was in the British sector. And all these other Indians were also with him. And there are lots of stories that they were telling us, which were quite amusing, some of them. And my father kept contact with all these people as far as he could. So that's why we came in contact with many of these people. Here you can see, these were three of the broadcasters from Azad Hind Radio and Azad Muslim Radio and Congress Radio. That was Habibur Rahman and Dr. Faruqi. They came on the ship with my parents back to India. And that was also interesting because after imprisonment, my father had to stay in a town called Braunschweig and was not allowed to move out of that town. So my mother came to live with him, and my sister was already born. They were together. And it was Pandit Nehru and Krishna Menon who were negotiating with the British, and they got the permission for many of these Indians to return to India. So on this ship, there were these three, but there might have been some more, but these were the better known ones. So they were received by a small committee, and so it was also in the press. There's an article on them. Yeah, so that was 1947. They returned to India, and after that, we had a lot of contact with with some of these soldiers and people who were imprisoned with my father. There was Ali Muhammad Sultan. He was actually the son of the owner of Charminar Cigarettes in India, which is the largest cigarette factory in India. So he was a rich man, and he didn't have to work. He lived in Berlin with his wife and two children. And he also had a wife in Hyderabad. So he kept coming to India. And on these visits, he visited us. And it was always very interesting and very nice to see him, because he was an excellent cook. He used to cook for us, Mughlai curry. That was really a treat. Then there was Bhavesh Baduri. He also came to visit us. And I only recently heard that Mr. Giri's father was probably his colleague in a company in India. And that's an interesting connection. And then Mr. Kenny, D.R. Kenny, he was from Goa. And we met him. It was also very interesting to see him. We also went to Goa and met him at his home. This photo is taken at our place. And then there's Khurshid Mama. Mama, he was a very intelligent, very good mathematician. And my father used to tell stories of him in his prison cell. The walls were fully written with mathematical formulae. So these are the kind of people that were in Berlin at that time. Yes, so and then one person I think who comes in, who you read about in all the literature, is M.R. Vyas. He was the secretary of Netaji in Berlin, and he came back to Bombay, and he started the Indo-German Cultural Society. And we were very, very often with him together, and they had plays and all sorts of other functions. And one of these plays was Rabindranath Tagore's Dakgar, which is for the post office. But the interesting thing was it was in German language. And in this Indo-German Cultural Society, many Indians had learned German. So he decided to involve them as actors in this. So I played the role of Amal, and yeah, the rest of them were all Indians which had just learned German at this Indo-German Cultural Society. So I thought that is quite interesting. There you can see that Mr. Vyas was very, very active in Bombay, even after the war. And then he wrote this book, which is it's talked about in many, many documents about the turbulent era. Yeah, so I think that gives a little bit of a picture of what my father, how he was involved in the Indian Legion.
Thank you, Mr. Mukherji.
Yes.
And as I have told you, I will repeat it again. You must attempt to put all this together in a book, as and how it is possible. I don't know, but fascinating. And before it, we lose out on the efforts of so many persons, known and unknown faces, because today many of us are perhaps hearing these names for the first time, but it is the same people who had been in Germany at that point in time, either as students or as someone else, as your father had written in that letter to in Times of India. The one thing that that caught me in that letter is when Netaji was asking for money in the Far East, everybody came out and donated, whereas the people in Germany, when he was setting this up, they were just dropping their ambitions and joining Netaji for that matter. So without any expectation, but just at the call of Netaji that time. So thank you for helping us know many, your father, as well as many unknown personalities. Anitaji, you must have something to say, because there is a lot of connection that you have directly or indirectly on this topic.
Well, I also have only second-hand information, because I was not yet born, or at the most a small infant when some of these photos were taken. But we have to see that the Indians who were involved with the Indian Center Free India and the Indian Legion in Germany were rather different from those that joined the INA in the Far East, because essentially the Indians in Germany were not permanent residents there. They had come as students, and some were prisoners of war, and they sort of flocked together to support this movement. And no doubt for some it was also a matter of sort of securing their own position, maybe also their own livelihood, because they were sort of cut off from their family. Whereas in the Far East, I mean, you did not only have wealthy people who donated a lot of money and jewelry and God knows what to the movement, but you had many very simple plantation workers participating in the independence struggle, who in fact had very often not lived in India at all, or not lived there for a very long time, and they had made their home in the Far East. And Netaji got them to sort of identify with their country in a more active way and dedicate themselves to the struggle for independence, even though they had sort of made a home somewhere else. And for them, the movement was a different way of identifying with India than it was for the participants of the German Indian Legion, who very clearly identified as Indians and wanting to go back to India. I don't really know what the expectation of both Netaji and the members of the Indian Legion in Germany were, whether they sort of, or some of them had a hope that they would actively sort of fight against Britain or fight going to India. Over time, definitely, these expectations changed, possibly in the beginning when Netaji first came to Germany in 1941. There was a vague possibility that military aggression would be carried towards India or into India, which by the time he left, of course, was totally lost. That was after the defeat in North Africa, after the defeat of the German military in North Africa and also in the Soviet Union. And to some extent, as Professor Pelinka mentioned, it in the Indian Legion in Germany and the Center for Free India in Germany sort of started a number of activities which later on were taken up in the Far East again, and they sort of had a broader basis of a much larger support of people living in that area. So I think it was a very different kind of movement, really. But I think a number of developments were started in Germany, which played a later part. Of course, some of a more symbolic nature, like singing the national anthem for the first time in Germany. And by the way, also the title Netaji was coined in Germany.
Correct.
So I think let that be enough for the time being. And
also Jai Hind and a few other words
went
in Germany.
Yeah. See, there was a question to me, and I think this has to do with the usage or the coinage of the term in this conversation, and we have been using it quite easily. German INA. So I guess unless some of you want to correct it, I think it was more to differentiate between the Azad Hind force in the east and the Indian Legion in the west. That the word German INA was perhaps used as an afterthought. I don't think it was the term that was used since the beginning, because Mr. Mukherjee, in your father's letter to Times of India in 1957, even the term German INA has been used there. But I guess he used it to correlate with the people's sentiment with the INA at that point in time.
Yes, I have a few documents from that time and also correspondence between former friends of his. And there's always talk of INA. Indian Legion is a term I came across only very much later. But I don't know. I mean, both words, both names are
interchangeably used.
Interchangeable, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good. So we are almost towards the close of today's session. We are right over the hour. Dr. Pelinka, I will like to come back to you, please, because I wish to have the later half post 2nd November till the time Netaji left Germany, and that covers mostly the 1942 period. If you can help us have some color there.
I think if we compare Netaji in Berlin and Netaji in Singapore, we can understand why Berlin was, for political and military reasons, just the wrong place for someone fighting for Indian independence. After reaching Singapore, Subhash Chandra Bose was immediately invited by the Japanese Prime Minister to come to Tokyo. And he was not only allowed to build an Indian national army, was also invited to the summit conference about the greater East Asian sphere as a representative of an Indian government in exile. So from the Japanese side, he was treated on the same eye level like other major actors in the Asian sphere of World War II, so different from from the neglect he had to face from Hitler and Nazi Germany. He had to wait for a brief meeting with Hitler for month and month and month. It was never taken seriously by the German leadership. The Japanese leadership, for understandable reasons, but for realistic reasons, took Netaji seriously. And this is a big difference. Of course, we cannot speculate what would have happened if Netaji would have come to Japan earlier, because Japan did not enter the war until December 1941. But Germany, just to underline it, proved to be, again, the wrong Nazi Germany, not Germany in principle. Nazi Germany was the wrong place to be for someone fighting for Indian independence, fighting for freedom from the British rule. It is different. It has been different in Singapore when Netaji became the head of the provisional government and also structured a government and especially an army more or less following the secular understanding of Indian identity that had been also dominated the International Congress. And India beyond religions, beyond castes, an Indian nation which is more than just the combination of Bengalis and Tamils and. This was important, but it was again too late. It was the right place, but not the right time anymore. I think there was no right time left.
I know he has been ruining the fact that Singapore has fallen on 15th of February 1942, and he needed to be in Singapore at that point in time. That is perhaps he has mentioned somewhere. So that's where he was in a hurry to move to the Far East as much as 1 year earlier than he actually did. Anyway, I think thank you for throwing that light. We had a good discussion where we had Dr. Pelinka, your macro perspective on Netaji's presence between 1941 and 43, and Mr. Mukherji, your sharing of the anecdotes around your father is perhaps coming to the public domain for the first time. I think that is one of the purposes of us relentlessly pursuing this initiative around the Anita Dialogues every month, because it is not just about the life and legacy of Netaji, but also the people he influenced, the societies he worked with, the concepts he created, and how perhaps his portions of the life is needed to be brought into mainstream more and more. back home in India, we have, I'm sure, we have many people who know about the details of Netaji's life on that part of the world. But I have to admit that there are still a lot of gray area about the information that needs to be discovered through the archives here in Europe. And there are many such books which needs to be translated in Bengali, perhaps, in order to reach the larger Bengali population, for them to know all these activities that Netaji did, to the extent of reaching to the individuals like Mr. Mukherji's father, who suffered, who put their passion, who sacrificed their original purpose in profession and life to jump into the independence struggle. The last word for this, I would like to leave it to Dr. Pfaff, if you want to make some closing comments.
We have covered a number of different phases of Netaji's life and his struggle for independence during the previous months. And even though the number of years that he spent in Europe during that period were not that extensive, I think apart from the fact that, of course, for me personally, they were of great importance, or I would not be here. But I think his way of thinking, his way of dealing with aspects for the struggle for independence, certainly to a larger extent took place in Germany or in Austria before that, and other parts of Europe as well. And I think, even though this may not have been the original intent when he sort of escaped from imprisonment in India, when he came to Austria in 1933, and then later on again came to Germany in 1941. I think even though some historians originally sort of downplayed the effect that the Indian National Army in the East and the movement in Europe had, I think it in many ways all these phases sort of came together in shaping the overall effect. And of course, now we know that particularly the time spent in East Asia certainly did have a major impact on the ultimate result of India becoming independent. So Jai Hind to all of you.
Thank you.
See
yeah.
Some of
Before
you
closing,
time.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing, that we discussed a November milestone in Netaji's life. So we talked about Free India Center, which was established in 2nd November. There is another milestone, which is actually Dr. Pelinka mentioned, the Great East Asia Conference, where Netaji was invited as an observer of the government of India in exile. That was on 6th of November, actually. 10th of November was also a milestone, because it was on that day, it appears that the British and the American got a wind of Netaji being in Berlin, and it was announced by them. Till that time, I guess, if I'm not wrong, Netaji was still masquerading as Orlando Mazzotta. It was on this date, on 10th of November. And apart from that, actually, the biggest milestone in November in Netaji's life is something else. And I would like Mr. Mukherji to perhaps talk about it before we close as a parting statement.
Yes, I know you must be referring to Anita Pfaff's birthday on the 29th of November. That was a big event for the family. In this connection, I'd like to mention one thing. Her mother and my mother were very close friends. And when Anita was born, or I don't know, a few months later, Mimi Schenkel, Anita's mother, asked my mother to be Anita's godmother. That is a German tradition over here. And when my sister Gita was born 2 years later, Anita's mother, Mimi Schenkel, became godmother of my sister. So in actual fact, I feel that Anita is actually like my elder sister. So we won't congratulate you now because that's not normally done in Germany, but we keep it in mind. On the 29th, we'll all be thinking of you and wishing you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
So that brings curtains to today's event. And the Anita Dialogues will be back on 12th of December, Sunday, with another episode to discuss Netaji, his life, legacy, people, and others around him. Thank you, Dr. Pelinka, Dr. Pfaff, Mr. Mukherji, and the audience for joining us on this Sunday evening. We will keep this dialogue going in the coming months as well. Jai Hind, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.